Oh, hello there. YouTube game the bottom half of HP Lovecraft's cat here, back at it again with another banger. Okay, before we start this video, I want to give just a quick disclaimer, a little bit of a content warning here. We're going to be discussing things like civil rights and having people actually live as they are. And I really want to make this point, the TLDR of this video. If in reaction to the recent political violence, your realization is that you could suddenly be a target too, welcome to the experience of any person of color, trans, or any minority, anyone that is an immigrant. Not even just before Donald Trump. We're talking about through the history of America. So if that upsets you, go ahead and click off. Go ahead and leave your angry comments. That's great for the algorithm. And that's kind of my filter for this video. If you made it this far, then you actually might be interested in what I have to say. And one last thing, Kirby says trans whites. Trans rights.
This is the story of a boy and his dream. But more than that, it is the story of an American boy in a dream that is truly American.
The rat done bit my sister Nell, with Whitey on the moon, and her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still while Whitey's on the moon. You know the man just upped my rent last night? Because Whitey's on the moon, no hot water, no toilets, and no lights, but Whitey's on the moon. I wonder why he's upping me. Because Whitey's on the moon, I was already giving him 50 a week, and now Whitey's on the moon. Taxes taking my whole damn check.
So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, watching my kids navigate their own identity transformation while consuming horror content through completely different channels than I did. They're encountering these themes through streaming algorithms, social media discourse, and peer recommendations that I am still just now learning to decode. Like, what is Italian brain rot? But here is something that would probably make H.P. Lovecraft himself roll over in his weirdly racist grave. Some of the most powerful contemporary horror comes from the exact communities that he has spent his entire career demonizing. Isn't it ironic, don't you think? The man who couldn't handle riding the subway with immigrants has somehow become an inadvertent architect for works that systematically dismantle white supremacy. It's like watching someone build a haunted house only to have the ghosts show up and start critiquing the architect's terrible interior design choices. Boo you whore indeed. But like, here's the thing about cosmic horror that hits different when you are raising multiracial kids in a world that is increasingly polarized. Its fundamental premise that the universe operates according to rules beyond human comprehension and control, that cosmic dread that white audiences tend to experience as existential revelation, it's really just Tuesday afternoon for many black and brown families that are trying to explain why their kids need absolutely different safety conversations than their classmates. As we would call it in the community, the talk. Today we're exploring 3 works that span nearly a century and create this really wild genealogy of resistance. First, we have H.P. Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Hook. We have Victor LaValle's 2016 response, The Ballad of Black Tom, and then we are going to end with Ryan Coogler's 2025 film, Sinners. And together they demonstrate how cosmic horror has transformed from xenophobic propaganda into a tool for exposing oppression and imagining racial resistance. So if you came here just for Sinners, I'm sorry, but you're going to learn about a book first. The insight, completely unintended by Lovecraft, provides the very foundation for the revolutionary responses that followed, which is like the blackest thing that you can do, is once again take somebody's racism and turn it into something innovative and cool. Literary scholar Josue Morales Dominguez called this technique narrative surgery, maintaining the exact story structure while inverting its moral universe. It's not destruction, it's reconstruction that's using the original blueprints for opposite purposes. Dominguez notes that these contemporary authors don't separate monstrosity from racism. They reveal racism itself as a process that creates these monsters. This pattern of transformation, taking tools of oppression and turning them into instruments of liberation, isn't new. As I explored in my video on how black musicians created and revolutionized rock music, this has been happening for centuries in American culture. From spirituals to metal, marginalized communities have consistently transformed the very forms used to exclude them into vehicles for truth-telling. If you haven't seen that foundation, I'll link it below. Sinners is your entry point, the film getting everyone talking about vampires and colonialism, but its DNA traces directly back to Victor LaValle's The Ballad of Black Tom, which surgically revised Lovecraft's 1927 story, The Horror at Red Hook. And between them, Jordan Peele's Get Out provided that very needed cinematic bridge that taught mainstream audiences to recognize these patterns. This cosmic framework that Lovecraft created, vast and different forces that are operating beyond human comprehension, this lands completely differently depending on who's hearing it. Writer Chris Campbell crystallized this in his groundbreaking essay on Afrocosmicism. A deep and indescribable dread at the notion of an indifferent universe is a luxury only afforded to a person who has not experienced the malice of structural racism. And I think that is the thing that just makes it all click for me. Discovering that the universe doesn't care about anyone isn't really horrifying. It feels almost equalizing in a way. The real terror comes when you realize how many supposedly neutral forces actively participate in oppression through deliberate human choices, and this matters viscerally for how we engage with our kids about complex cultural material. Sinners works as a vampire movie with genuine scares and very killer music sequences, but it's also a masterclass in discussing American music history without sanitation. These films give us visual and narrative language for conversations that feel often impossible to ever start. And most importantly, for those of us who are raising kids who are navigating multiple identities daily, these stories demonstrate how communities have always faced impossible choices about belonging.
The junkies make me a nervous wreck. The price of food is going up. And as if all...
So let's go ahead and reestablish the foundation with Lovecraft's original story, which reads like xenophobia with a thesaurus. The Horror at Red Hook was published in Weird Tales in 1927. It follows Detective Thomas Malone investigating the Brooklyn neighborhood of Red Hook, which Lovecraft renders as a locus of supernatural evil, precisely because of its cultural diversity. And here's what makes this personally complicated for me as a parent. Lovecraft's technical innovation, it was genuinely brilliant, let's be honest. He developed cosmic horror as a literary framework. It's the idea that vast and different forces operate beyond human comprehension. It's sophisticated storytelling that influenced generations of creators that my kids and myself admire. This story opens with Malone recovering from a nervous breakdown, unable to handle crowds or the polyglot abyss of New York. Already we see Lovecraft's central anxiety, demographic mixing as a source of existential dread. Malone recalls his investigation into Robert Sudnem, an elderly occultist who has begun associating with Red Hook's immigrant communities, what Lovecraft calls the dregs of unwholesome centuries. But his application consistently identifies immigrants and people of color as these conduits of otherworldly threats. Communities creating the Jazz Age's cultural renaissance became literal manifestations of evil from beyond. The actual architects of American cool became literal manifestations of otherworldly evil. When Lovecraft describes Red Hook's population, he uses language that wouldn't be out of place in eugenic propaganda. And I quote, YouTube, I quote here, I am quoting from Lovecraft, "Slant-eyed folk who held newer and more terrible orgiastries, dark wanderers, primitive half-ape savagery." Goddamn, dude. 1930s Disney racism. And this is why context matters when our kids encounter classic literature. They need to know it is a historical artifact. It's not universal truth. Half ape, like, Jesus. Like, this makes this particularly insidious for developing readers on how Lovecraft characterizes Detective Malone as a sensitive intellectual, a Dublin University man born in a Gregorian villa near Phoenix Park. Malone is presented as too refined for ordinary police work, too perceptive for comfortable existence. This positioning presents xenophobia not as ignorance, but as elevated understanding. The more you know, the more that you should fear demographic change. You're waiting for everyone else to wake up. This plot escalates as Malone investigates reports of kidnappings that are connected to immigrant religious practices. The population is a hopeless tangle and enigma. Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and Negro elements impinging upon one another, and fragments of Scandinavian and American belts lying not far distant. It's the "I'm not racist, I'm just being realistic, doesn't statistics matter" type of nonsense dressed in purple prose. Lovecraft uses the language of anthropological objectivity to mask his racial panic. I mean, it's the exact same thing with the ancient aliens theories. It couldn't be brown people made the pyramids, it had to have been Cthulhu. Aliens. Yog-Sothoth. It is a babble of sound and filth. Like, even the Scandinavians are getting it right now. This man's racism is just like, it's almost unparalleled. Notice that word though, babble. Lovecraft explicitly collects linguistic diversity to biblical punishment. Suggesting different languages in the same space represents divine condemnation. For a writer whose entire life revolves around language, the inability to understand his neighbor's words become an existential threat. But think about what this means for the immigrant families in question. Their mother tongues, the languages that they use to comfort their children and preserve their histories, it just gets transformed into eldritch incantations. The story's climax involves Malone discovering that these communities are literally summoning demons through cultural practices. This police raid destroys 3 tenement buildings, killing dozens of immigrants, and Lovecraft ends up framing this violence as heroic, civilization defending itself against a cosmic evil. The immigrants aren't merely just wrong, they are cosmically wrong. The systems that govern society, redlining, immigration law, educational access, it can often seem itself vast, uncaring, and impossible to comprehend as the old ones themselves. When Lovecraft writes about the horrors of the half-known, he's accidentally describing the experience of navigating systems never designed to include you in the first place. When he describes forces operating according to alien logic, he's inadvertently capturing what it feels like to be judged by your standards that you yourself are just never allowed to learn.
All that wasn't enough. A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon.
So Victor LaValle's 2016 novella, The Ballad of Black Tom, performs narrative surgery on Lovecraft's original story. LaValle, who dedicates the book to H.P. Lovecraft, with all my conflicted feelings. It keeps the exact same plot structure while completely inverting its moral universe. This demonstrates something that I'm constantly trying to show to my kids. You don't have to just throw out powerful tools because they were created by people with absolutely terrible values. Sometimes the most radical act itself is showing what else that those tools are able to build. Now, where Lovecraft opens with Detective Malone's refined sensibilities being assaulted by diversity, LaValle opens with Charles Thomas Tester, a 20-year-old black man navigating 1920s New York through careful performance. LaValle immediately establishes the survival techniques that are required. He'd learned to make himself invisible, to become part of the scenery, to make himself so still that white folks' eyes would just pass right through him. Drax be damned. But Tommy isn't actually invisible. He's performing invisibility. code switching, as one might say, code switching between different versions of himself depending on who his audience is. With white clients, he affects a Caribbean accent, plays up the exotic mysticism. With black folks in Harlem, he drops the act. With police, he becomes just so unremarkable they forget him immediately. This isn't deception, it's the advanced emotional intelligence that is applied to life or death navigation that you have to think about on a daily basis. LaValle writes, "Becoming unremarkable, invisible, compliant, those were useful tricks for a black man in an all-white neighborhood. Survival techniques. But depending on the people that you know in your life, it's something that you've probably heard quite a few times before. The same shape-shifting Lovecraft feared becomes sophisticated social technology developed by people who can't really afford to be seen incorrectly in any type of way. Tommy makes his living as a hustler, delivering occult texts and performing at strange gatherings for wealthy white clients. But unlike Lovecraft's immigrants who are corrupted by otherworldly knowledge, Tommy understands exactly what he's dealing with. When he removes the final page from a dangerous mystical text before delivery, rendering it completely harmless, he demonstrates the strategic thinking that marginalized communities have always needed, giving their oppressors just enough to satisfy them while keeping the real power for yourself. For parents, one could say that this would be a way to discuss code switching without abstraction, through specific stories with very specific stakes. In Lovecraft's version, Robert Sodom represents corrupted civilization, good breeding fallen under immigrant influence. His association with Red Hook signals descent from respectability into contamination. Lovecraft describes him as having, quote, the most heterogeneous melange of people as his associates, presenting diversity itself as moral decay. LaValle keeps Sodom but transforms what he represents. Here, Sodom isn't being corrupted by foreign influence, he's extracting value from marginalized communities while remaining safely insulated. He's the wealthy white patron who collects exotic experiences in brown bodies like curiosities. He's the cultural vampire who feeds on others' authenticity while contributing nothing. Foreshadowing is a literary device. When Robert hires Tommy to play guitar at an occult gathering in his Flatbush mansion, the transaction reveals everything about cultural appropriation. Sodom wants authentic black music to power his mystical experiments, but not actual black humanity in his space. Tommy's music has value, but his life does not. This changes everything. LaValle also adds a detail that's both hilarious and horrifying. Sodom tests Tommy's mystical knowledge by showing him a symbol and asking what he sees. Tommy recognizes it as the yellow sign from Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow. Sodom, satisfied with this performance of primitive wisdom, hires him immediately. The white occultist can't recognize he's being played by someone better read than he is. LaValle's inciting incident cuts straight to the heart. Tommy's father, Otis Tester, is murdered in their Harlem apartment by Private Detective Howard. Subtle nod to Howard Phillips Lovecraft himself. The detective investigating reports of illegal music performances mistakes Otis' guitar for a rifle in darkness and shoots him dead. It's a pretty on-the-nose metaphor, but stay with me here. LaValle doesn't need supernatural elements for horror. The guitar representing the Tester family's musical heritage, their connection to Southern roots and cultural continuity becomes, in white authorities' paranoid imagination, a weapon that requires lethal response. The instrument Otis played at a church, at rent parties, at moments that built community, gets him killed in his own home. And this historical pattern, black musical instruments seen as threats, extends from Otis's guitar to modern police responses to boomboxes and car stereos. The continuity is just devastating. When Tommy learns of his father's murder, LaValle delivers the line crystallizing his entire project. What was indifference compared to malice? indifference would be such a relief. Lovecraft's entire cosmology revolves around the horror of cosmic indifference, the terrible revelation that the universe doesn't care. But for Tommy, for black folks navigating American racism, an indifferent universe seems like an upgrade. The cosmos might not care, but it's not actively hunting black men in their bedrooms. And here's where LaValle's moral framework gains complexity Lovecraft himself never achieved. After his father's murder, Tommy doesn't become corrupted. He makes a calculated choice to ally with otherworldly forces. When Sodom shows him visions of cosmic destruction, Tommy isn't terrified by scale. He's attracted to the possibility of escaping systems designed to eliminate him. Tommy's transformation into Black Tom represents agency rather than victimization. He tells Detective Malone, who LaValle reveals is casually racist throughout, "I bear a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with. Wish to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin." The revelation comes when you recognize the Frankenstein echo. LaValle deliberately invokes Mary Shelley, making it explicit the connection between social ostracism and what society labels monstrous. The monster isn't born, it is made by systems denying its humanity. Tommy doesn't become Black Tom because cosmic forces corrupt him. He chooses that transformation because human society offers nothing but grief. When Tommy finally speaks the words summoning the cosmic being, LaValle writes, "Till now, he'd been playing at the game of magic, but now he opened his mouth and sang the supreme alphabet. The music white society tried to silence becomes a mechanism for calling down judgment. The cultural expression they try to suppress becomes the very weapon that they cannot defend against." So in Lovecraft's story, it ends with order restored through violence. The narrative confirms its thesis that some populations are just inherently threatening. LaValle's conclusion delivers devastating insight about community and belonging. Black Tom's final words to Malone, "I'll take Cthulhu over you devils any day." The cosmic being might destroy the world, but it won't claim moral superiority while doing it.
"I am born the unspeakable. The skulls of those who defy me bleach in the suns of 100 worlds. And you are?"
Cosgrove. And if you move, I'll pop you in the lip.
Oh?
The tragedy isn't corruption, it's that he had community in Harlem but was seduced by validation from those who would never even see him as human. When your teenager insists on that one thing that defines them, that instrument, that sport, that style, Tommy shows us why it matters to let them hold on. What makes LaValle's technique pedagogically brilliant is that he shares experiences with readers, no condescending exposition about why racism is bad. Instead, we experience Tommy's code switching. We feel his father's death, and we understand his impossible choices from inside his skin. But transforming these literary techniques in the cinematic language required an intermediate step. Someone had to show mainstream audiences that horror could name its real monsters without metaphor.
Her face and arms began to swell. Whitey's on the moon. With all that money I made last year, or Whitey on the moon, I come.
Enter Jordan Peele's 2017 masterpiece, Get Out. It became that essential bridge between LaValle's literary revision and contemporary film horror. Legal scholar Renee Nicole Allen's groundbreaking analysis reveals how Peele's sunken place functions simultaneously as Lovecraftian void and lived experience. Quote, "A metaphor for the feelings of helplessness and subjugation that Black people experience in society built on systemic institutional racism," unquote. Like, look at the mechanism itself. Peele's genius lies in its specificity. When Missy Armitage hypnotizes Chris Washington, she doesn't send his consciousness to another dimension. She sends it down, literally sinking into a void within his own body, where he observes reality through a distant screen but cannot affect it. He screams, producing no sound. He struggles, creating no movement. He remains conscious, but he lacks agency. And this is Lovecraft's existential revelation made visceral. But unlike Lovecraft's protagonists who discover insignificance through shocking revelation, reading forbidden texts, or witnessing cosmic beings, Chris Washington always knew the universe was hostile. The revelation isn't insignificance, it's discovering how many seemingly benign forces actively maintain that insignificance. Peele himself explained, "The sunken place means that we're marginalized. No matter how hard we scream, the system silences us." And what made this specifically Lovecraftian rather than metaphorical is the mechanism. Hypnosis sending consciousness to a void while the body remains functional. It's possession without the supernatural. It's colonization without the invasion. The auction scene where white guests evaluate Chris's physical attributes while planning to inhabit his body makes explicit what was subtextual in Lovecraft: the reduction of certain populations to just resources. But where Lovecraft saw demographic mixing as contamination, Peele reveals that appropriation is the true horror. The white characters don't fear black bodies, they covet them while erasing black consciousness. Dean Armitage's line, "I would have voted for Obama for a third term," becomes the film's thesis about liberal racism, speaking progressive language while maintaining oppressive structures. The Armitages aren't Lovecraft's working class xenophobes. They're educated liberals who literally found ways to inhabit blackness while eliminating black consciousness. They want the physical advantages without lived experience, struggle, or humanity. And the film's climax reveals not individual evil, but once again, systemic practice. The Order of the Coagula, whose name references alchemical transformation, has performed this procedure for decades. They're not a cult that happened to target black people, they're a system designed specifically for exploitation. The horror isn't unprecedented action, but literalization of what American society has always done, extracting value while denying humanity. What connects us to our genealogy is how Peele uses horror frameworks to expose real levers of power. So the hypnosis sending Chris to the sunken place isn't just fundamentally different from the psychological manipulation that is convincing people that their marginalization is completely natural. It's taking innovation while erasing its creators. See examples like, the stoplight and the elevator and peanut butter and whatever things that we were told during Black History Month that black people did that white people took credit for. This becomes a visual grammar that Ryan Coogler builds upon. He's recognizing that supernatural horror itself and institutional racism aren't metaphorically connected, but instead they are literal manifestations of the exact same force.
I ain't got no money here. Whitey's on the moon. I just about had my fill.
Ryan Coogler's Sinners creates sophisticated synthesis between LaValle's literary techniques and contemporary cinema, proving these themes remain urgent nearly a century after Lovecraft. Set in 1932, just 5 years after Red Hook was published, the film demonstrates how each generation adds layers to this ongoing conversation. This narrative follows identical twins, Smoke and Stack, both played by Michael B. Jordan, World War I veterans who spent years in Chicago working for Al Capone and the Irish mob. They return to Clarksdale, Mississippi, the crossroads where Robert Johnson allegedly sold his soul to establish a juke joint. Like Tommy Tester, they're entrepreneurs navigating hostile systems, but with capital stolen from white gangsters, marking them as targets and threats to multiple power structures. Coogler introduces the supernatural through music, expanding LaValle's conjure music concept through cinematic techniques prose can't achieve. Sammy, the twins' cousin played by newcomer Miles Caton, possesses the ability to blur the line between life and death through playing guitar. But unlike Tommy's father, whose music got him killed, Sammy's music is recognized even by opponents as genuinely powerful. The film opens with Sammy stumbling into his father's church, bloodied and carrying a broken guitar, immediately establishing the instrument as both a weapon and wound. Then, when we flash back to the 24 hours earlier, we understand that we're watching the last day before transformation, a structure echoing Fruitvale Station and its documentation of Oscar Grant's final day. This isn't metaphorical. It's historical. The guitar itself became a site of resistance. From Sister Rosetta Tharpe to Jimi Hendrix, black musicians consistently transform potential tools of oppression into instruments of freedom. The entire genealogy lives in Sammy's grip on those strings. Educational psychologist Anne Lynn's research on narrative identity formation helps explain why Sammy's guitar obsession resonates with young viewers. She describes how adolescents use fictional narratives as self-objects, external stories constructing internal identity. So when Sammy refuses to abandon his guitar, even when facing death itself, young viewers are witnessing a model for maintaining their authentic self, even when systems themselves demand capitulation. Remember earlier when I mentioned teenagers having, that one thing that defines their entire personality? Yeah, this is an example of what I'm talking about. I mean, we all went through our cringe teenager whatever phase. I went through like 3 of them. But that's exactly what Sammy is going through, and that is becoming fundamental to who he becomes as an adult. The film's transcendent sequence occurs when Sammy performs at the juke joint opening. As his fingers hit strings, the film explodes into a temporal chaos. Coogler and cinematographer Autumn Durald Arkapaw create visual symphony where past, present, and future collapse into one dancing moment. But here's where the scene gains depth beyond spectacle. We see African drummers whose rhythms survive the middle passage, field hollers becoming blues, blues becoming jazz, jazz becoming rock, rock becoming hip-hop, and hip-hop becoming whatever else comes next. Each transformation preserves essential elements while adapting to new contexts. Preservation through transformation made literal. Like Coogler visualizes what's been taking me about 45 minutes to explain historically. These drummers aren't ghosts or memories, they're actively present. Their rhythms undergirding everything that follows. And this isn't time travel, it's the revelation that all black music exists simultaneously, with each era drawing from and feeding into the others. Ludwig Göransson's score doesn't just accompany the sequence, it becomes a character revealing hidden connections. The drums speak to the guitars and the guitars answer saxophones. And suddenly we understand this isn't just musical evolution, but spiritual technology. Through music, we can maintain a connection across time and space that slavery tried to sever. But the same music that connects also attracts. And Sammy's performance attracts the attention of something ancient and hungry, which sets up the film's central conflict between preservation and predation. So what does it mean when the colonized become the colonizers? The film's most sophisticated innovation lies in its theological complexity through Remick, played by Jack O'Connell. Remick is an Irish immigrant leading the vampire collective that attacks the juke joint. This casting transforms traditional victim-predator dynamics into historical analysis of how oppression reproduces itself. He's singing an Irish ballad about exile and loss, immediately establishing him as someone who understands displacement. If he survives centuries of English colonial occupation, and visual cues suggest that he is far older than he appears, his vampiric existence becomes inextricably linked to colonial trauma. And the historical context here matters. The Irish penal laws beginning in 1965 represent comprehensive cultural genocide. These laws didn't just suppress Catholic practice, they systematically dismantled Irish language, education, land ownership, and cultural transmission. By 1703, Irish Catholics, 90% of the population, owned less than 10% of the Irish land. And this is where Coogler's theological framework gets genuinely unsettling, but in a good way. When Remick and his collective recite the Lord's Prayer in perfect unison, they're not being repelled by holy words. They're performing the theological framework that is used to justify their own cultural erasure. For survivors of colonial occupation, Christianity doesn't represent salvation. It represents the religion that destroyed their spiritual practices while demanding gratitude. And this reframes vampire invitation mythology completely. Traditional folklore says vampires need consent to cross thresholds. But what happens when the invitation was extracted through violence? When consent itself becomes survival, and when accepting your oppressor's worldview becomes the only way to protect your family. In this dynamic, the formerly oppressed becoming oppressors appears throughout American music history. Remick's offer to the juke joint patrons personifies what historian David Rogier calls the wages of whiteness. How groups like the Irish achieved provisional acceptance through participating in anti-black oppression. But Coogler suggests something that is a bit more disturbing: spiritual colonization so complete that the colonized become missionaries for their own trauma. The invitation problem returns, but now we see it's never really about invitation. It's about what makes saying no impossible. And also, the revelation of the twins' World War I service transforms their story from generic crime narrative into historically specific tragedy. Black World War I veterans faced what historian Chad Williams calls torchbearers of democracy abroad, second-class citizens at home. The Red Summer of 1919, named by James Weldon Johnson, saw at least 25 major race riots and 97 recorded lynchings. Black veterans were specifically targeted, not despite military service, but because of it. Their training made them threats. Their uniforms made them targets. Their refusal to accept pre-war subordination made them enemies. Veterans like Henry Johnson received France's Croix de Guerre, sorry if I mispronounced that, but the Croix de Guerre, but couldn't get served in Alabama restaurants. Wilbert Little was lynched in Georgia for refusing to remove his uniform, literally killed for wearing evidence of his service. The twins carry this history in their bodies, military bearing marking them as men who've killed for a country that just wants them dead. When Stack tells his brother, "I don't want any of that smoke to get on her," the line carries multiple meanings. Smoke referencing gunfire, violence, criminal residue, but also the smoke of burned black neighborhoods during Red Summer, smoke of lynching fires, and the smoke that follows black achievement in America. And, probably Smoke himself. But once again, it's a specific phrasing. Preservation through transformation. And another fun little thing that I noticed that I want to touch up upon, and I'll probably expand upon this more in a later video, but let's talk about the Chow family real quick. So a really interesting thematic exploration that happens in parallel throughout the movie is Grace and Bo Chow and the operation of their grocery store alongside the Smokestack twins and also all these racist white people. The Chow's presence in 1932 Mississippi also reflects historical reality that is also erased from most segregation narratives, and that's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that positioned Chinese immigrants in racial limbo, neither white nor black, but forced to navigate between both worlds. In Mississippi specifically, Chinese grocers often served black communities when white businesses wouldn't, creating relationships of both genuine solidarity and economic necessity. Their store becomes a place where racial categories blur, not through utopian colorblindness, but through shared recognition of provisional belonging. They serve black customers, speak enough local dialect to communicate, understand Jim Crow's unspoken rules, but remain forever foreign. And I think that this adds layers to understanding how different communities navigate white supremacy, not as unified front, but as groups making separate, often conflicting calculations about survival. The Chows aren't simply allies or exploiters, but people making impossible choices within structures they didn't create and they can't really escape. And meanwhile, Sammy faces his own impossible choice. His father, a preacher, sees his son Blue's guitar as literally demonic, a tool of spiritual corruption requiring destruction for salvation. But Sammy's water immersion scene creates baptismal imagery that destabilizes our understanding of spiritual authenticity. The water connects to African diasporic traditions where rivers represent crossroads between worlds. Yoruba traditions honoring water deities like Oshun and Yamoja survived the Middle Passage, transformed but not erased. These practices became ring shout ceremonies, they became river baptisms, they became foundational African American spiritual oppression. Yet Christian baptism systematically appropriated these very same rituals, transforming cleansing into submission. When Sammy goes underwater still clutching his guitar, refusing to release it even for salvation, he is making a theological statement. Authentic spiritual power resides in cultural expression rather than imposed doctrine. So where does real divinity lie in all this? In the prayers demanding cultural death or the music preserving cultural life? To me, the film suggests that the guitar contains more genuine spirituality than sermons condemning it. Throughout various sequences, Sammy cannot abandon the instrument. It provides more protection than prayer does. It provides more power than theology, and more truth than doctrine demanding its destruction. This is why I once again reiterate, when your teenager fights for that one thing that they say defines them, Sammy shows why we should let them have that. Let them go ahead and have that. Preservation through transformation requires something that is to them worth preserving. And the film's climax brings all of these threads together in an explosion that is simultaneously supernatural and historically grounded. When vampires arrive at the juke joint, they don't burst in with otherworldly force. They stand at the threshold, singing Irish folk songs, asking politely for invitation. They perform whiteness's most insidious trick, presenting violence as civility and making victims complicit in their destruction. And honestly, this moment also made me think of the novel of I Am Legend, the actual original novel with Robert whatever his name is, and every night all the vampires would come outside of his house, surround his house, and basically spend the entire night taunting him and trying to goad him into coming out or letting him in. There's a lot of parallels in that. So I guess, Will Smith is probably somewhere in this weird multiverse as well, with Wesley Snipes. But going back to the main topic at hand here, listen to the songs that Remick and his crew are actually singing. These are ballads of dispossession, songs of people driven from their land, melodies of forced exile. Remick's collective doesn't sing from power but from wound. Their Irish folk songs carry the same pain as Sammy's blues, the same loss as Chinese exile songs, and the same grief as spirituals. But instead of recognition creating solidarity, it produces competitive suffering. Who deserves relief from historical trauma? Whose pain grants more permission for inflicting pain on others? And the massacre that follows isn't just random bloodshed, but systemic conversation. The vampires don't just kill, they turn, creating new vampires who immediately begin hunting their own community. How the formerly oppressed become the new oppressors, and how liberation movements can get co-opted into maintaining the very structures that they fight against.
I think I'll send these doctor bills, airmail special.
So in conclusion, this genealogy, this isn't complete at all. It's one long thread in an ongoing conversation scholars are documenting in real time. Right now, emerging writers and filmmakers and probably game makers, indie devs, are creating responses to sinners that will reshape how the next generation also understands and internalizes these dynamics. What began as one racist man's paranoia about demographic and change has transformed into a robust framework for exposing oppression, creating solidarity across difference, and imagining resistance to structures treating entire populations as expendable. This genre that once insisted certain communities were cosmically wrong now reveals that the real cosmic horror is any system denying human complexity. The pattern emerging from this genealogy offers practical wisdom for our current moment. Criticism and creativity aren't opposites, they're dance partners. LaValle doesn't erase Lovecraft, he recontextualizes him, showing that those same tools can build in different hands. If I may be so bold, one could even say that Lovecraft has been taken back. Peele doesn't ignore horror's racist history. He weaponizes genre conventions against their origins. And Coogler doesn't reject vampire mythology. He reveals what it always meant, stripping away gothic romanticism to expose colonial violence underneath. So for those of us raising kids forming their own cultural identities in real time, this evolution offers very crucial scaffolding. Our children can learn to engage critically with inherited materials without choosing between wholesale rejection or uncritical consumption. They can understand that communities labeled as threats often possess exactly the artistic and spiritual resources necessary for collective survival, and that these communities have always been willing to share those resources with anyone approaching with genuine rather than extractive intent. The transformation from literary to cinematic horror also demonstrates how ideas evolve across mediums and recognition that the true horror lies not in otherworldly, cosmic, all-seeing entity threats, but in systems that make otherworldly alternatives seem reasonable. Young people that encounter these works learn that they don't need to choose between honoring cultural traditions and demanding justice. They can transform tools of horror into instruments of hope. They can write new verses to old songs, and most importantly, they learn that identity evolution through caring for others, caring for community, caring for the culture, isn't weakness, but probably the most powerful resistance available. And our job as parents isn't really shielding kids from this conversation, but really trying to just equip them to participate. Every generation performs their own version of narrative surgery. They reconstruct inherited materials for liberation rather than limitation. Reinterpreting things is how art is made. The monsters may change shape, they always change shape, but the pattern remains. Those that are labeled monstrous by different parts of society possess the clearest vision of what real monstrosity looks like. And this conversation, it will continue to evolve as new voices join, of course. What is both crazy and scary and insanely cool is that my kids will encounter forms of this genealogy I literally cannot imagine, and being delivered through technologies that more than likely don't exist yet. Which, like I said, terrifying and awesome. The future is always terrifying and awesome, but mainly terrifying right now. But if we've done our job, then they'll have the frameworks that they need to recognize both poison and the antidote, and to understand how oppression reproduces itself, and most importantly, the ability to actually imagine alternatives. But for now, this really racist ballet will continue, and each generation gets to add its new verse. So the question isn't whether or not our kids will continue these themes. Algorithms guarantee, hi, like and subscribe, algorithms guarantee that they will. The real question is whether or not they have the tools to recognize what they're seeing and the vocabulary to discuss it, and the vision to transform it into something better, something more provocative, and something more profound. So, with all of that in mind, with everything that I've said so far, what do you think are the verses that we are going to be teaching them to sing? And that's it, baby! That'll do this video. Thank you so much for making it to the end. Sorry it took so long, but I hope you can look at it and see why. Let me know what you think. Like I said, I didn't really talk about Lovecraft County just because the show was good. It wasn't great, but it was good. But I really hope that you all enjoy this. I know all this stuff with the YouTube algorithm right now. I hope that you guys all get to see it. I'm going to upload the director's cut of this on Patreon. So I might put the post up for $1 or whatever, but the director's cut of this, the unedited version, that's going up on Patreon because I lost almost a week of headache and frustration just trying to get parts of it up on YouTube. So I'm doing the director's cut on Patreon, then the edited version is going up on YouTube. And you know what? Doing it that way, it was very liberating. So it was very fun. But anyways, what you're probably looking at is, I don't know which version you're looking at right now. Anyways, let me know what you think. Give me a comment, give me a like, give me a subscribe, give me a share. Just give me your thoughts on the thing that I created and how it made you feel. And be mindful in the comments. I'm sure there's going to be weirdos and bigots and hateful people trying to stir up shit. Come on, just don't. I spent too many years on Facebook. You don't want none of this smoke. So just go about your day. And everyone else, thank you. We are slowly creeping up on 15,000, which is crazy. My stretch goal for this year is 50,000 for the end of the year. If that happens, I'm gonna get a tattoo of the little mascot guy, and that will be my first tattoo before my wife and kids. So you should all feel happy if we hit that goal, because you got I'm not gonna say you're more important than my wife and kids, but you guys are getting tattooed first. So yeah, anyways, thank you. I have a bunch of stuff that I need to do for Patreon, and yeah, I hope you all have a good rest of your however long ago you saw this. So thank you again. Love you all. Bye.